Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm Tanea Bannon with the Clifton Park Half Moon Public Library, and today we have professional genealogist Lisa Dougherty presenting myths about immigrant ancestors and how to find out the truth. Lisa will take questions at the end, so feel free to use the chat or the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to type in anything, and we'll address that at the conclusion. And I will hand it over to Lisa.
Thanks very much, Tanea, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. This is great. I really have been having a lot of fun doing these presentations. This month, we're going to talk about immigrant ancestors. Most of us, I would say, have had experience with researching immigrant ancestors, or maybe we just know we have immigrant ancestors and we're interested in researching them. Can be one of those things that can be pretty difficult to do. But one of the things that I find gets in the way sometimes of our research are the things that we think we know about immigrant ancestors. And those things can come from anywhere. They can come from fellow researchers. They can come from family members who have family stories. They can come from lots of different places. Generally, there's a lot of myths out there about immigrant ancestors, how they got here, what they did when they got here, where they came from. So there's lots of myths out there, and the purpose of this program is to give you some of the truth behind some of the most common myths about immigrant ancestors. And then towards the end, we're going to discuss some places you can find information about your own immigrant ancestor and maybe figure out what the real story is behind their coming to this country. All right, so before we get started, and my screen is not advancing. There we go. I just wanted to bring your attention to this program. This is going to be happening tonight, and it's going to be over at the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society. They're putting it on. It's a virtual presentation. It's called the New York Gateway, Immigration, Emigration, and Migration, and it's being presented by Jane Wilcox. She is a professional genealogist, and she's also a really great speaker. She's got a lot of experience in this area, and I figured since it was within the topic of what we're talking about today that people might be interested in tuning into this tonight. So if you want, you can go to the New York G&B website, which is newyorkfamilyhistory.org, and you can register to attend this webinar tonight at 7 o'clock. It should be really interesting. And again, Jane Wilcox is really well known and a great speaker. So I would encourage you to do that if you are interested in this topic. And I'm probably going to be taking frequent drinks of water just because I'm living in the middle of pollen festation right now, and my allergies are really driving me crazy. So if I take a few sips of water, that's why. Okay, so hopefully you'll have some time to look into this webinar tonight. All right, so this is one of the symbols of immigration to our country, the Statue of Liberty, but I really like this quote from Franklin Roosevelt. He was obviously president and also a great speaker, and he had a lot of perspective on a lot of different things. And so his quote says, remember always that all of us, and you and I especially, are descended from immigrants and revolutionists. So during this time period when Franklin Roosevelt was president, was one of the turning points and changing times for when immigrants were coming into this country. During the Great Depression, there was lots of economic problems. There were a lot of new things that came into being as far as the immigrants to this country. It's somewhat similar to the time period that we're going through now. There's a lot of question about immigration. So it was a similar time period. But we do know that our country was founded by immigrants, and many of the people that live here today are descended from immigrants, whether they arrived here before the United States was a country or if they've just only recently arrived here. But immigrants play a very important role in this country's history. And for something so important, naturally, it's going to be one of those things that there's going to be lots of stories, myths, and legends that grow up around this topic. So probably one of the biggest myths, I guess, is about Ellis Island. I think when people think immigration to the United States, they synonymously think Ellis Island. And they think, well, my immigrant ancestor had to have come through Ellis Island because Ellis Island means immigration. Some of us may have visited Ellis Island and seen the great displays there. And so it's just something that most people think, that if you were an immigrant and you came to the United States, that you went through Ellis Island. Well, the truth about Ellis Island is that it actually had a fairly limited time period of operation. In general, if your ancestor got here before 1892, they did not come through Ellis Island, because Ellis Island opened in 1892. Ellis Island was probably the place that processed the most immigrants coming into this country, but it was definitely not the only place that processed immigrants coming through this country. And not only was it not the only place in this country, it also wasn't the only place in New York. So you can see that there are definite time periods from when Ellis Island was in operation. That would be from 1892 to 1897, and then it closed briefly for 3 years and reopened in 1900 and kept processing through 1924. After that, immigrants still came to New York, and prior to that, immigrants still came to New York, but they just came to different facilities that were not called Ellis Island. A lot of us have ancestors that came through New York prior to the Ellis Island era in 1892. They possibly would have been processed through what was called Castle Garden, and there were also other state-run facilities that they could have been processed through. The estimation is that there were about 12 million immigrants that came into the United States through Ellis Island. So that's quite a significant number, and probably the largest number of any single place. But there was also another 12 million that came through New York, but were before the Ellis Island era. So that includes a lot of the German immigrants that came to this country. It concerns a lot of the famine Irish immigrants that came to this country. So 12 million through Ellis Island and about 12 million through New York before or after the Ellis Island era. So just keep in mind that Ellis Island was definitely probably the single most important immigrant processing station in the United States, but it was certainly not the only one. So where else did immigrants come into the United States? Well, another important port in the Northeast was Boston, where 2 million immigrants came to. Baltimore and Philadelphia were also very important immigrant ports for people coming from Europe, especially. Baltimore and Philadelphia tended to get immigrants that were headed to the Midwest. So if you have an ancestor that ended up in Illinois or Iowa or Minnesota, it's possible they could have come in through Baltimore or Philadelphia. A lot of times places would advertise for settlers that needed people to settle the land. And part of the process was to land in the port of Baltimore or the port of Philadelphia, where you would board a train and you would head to the Midwest where you would begin your settlement. So those were also important ports. There are also the port of New Orleans was very important before the Civil War. The port of San Francisco, where you will find a lot of immigrants that come from China or from that area of the world. And then there were also 500,000 additional ports, smaller ports, possible ports in the maritime province of Canada or places like New Bedford. So things like that. So there are lots of scattered ports around. And so Ellis Island certainly was not the only game in town when it came to immigration. So probably number 2 myth that is something that I hear repeated all the time, and probably, I don't know, maybe not monthly, but at least every 6 months I hear this from somebody. My ancestor's name was changed when they immigrated to the country by the officials in the port where they came in. Well, that's a very common myth. And as we know, there were lots of name changes. Some people deliberately wanted to change their name. Other people, maybe it happened through some other means, but there certainly were lots of name changes. The facts are that when the passenger lists were created, they were created from tickets that people purchased. And those tickets were sold in the country that they came from. And the shipping company or the passenger lists were made from the ship's company by people that were employed at the port where they got on the boat. So if they got on the boat in Bremen, Germany, the employees of the company that had the ship were from that local area. So they would compile the list from the tickets that they were given when people got on the boat. So therefore, the name that was on the ticket was the name that went on the passenger list. Generally, those would be the person's original name. Now, obviously, if you walked up to the boat and you didn't want to be John Smith anymore and you wanted to tell someone your name was Michael Murphy, then you could certainly do that. And there's nothing that anyone was going to do to stop you. But the point is that those lists were made from the tickets that were purchased by people getting on the ship. Obviously, many immigrants chose to change their names. And there were lots of reasons for this. They possibly would have gotten to the United States, and if English was not their native language, and their name was something that people who spoke English could not pronounce, they may have chosen to change their name to make it easier for them to get along in the United States. Possibly their name was changed by someone who was giving them help when they got here, possibly by an employer, or maybe a relative was already using a different name when they arrived here. So there's lots of reasons why there were name changes. Name changes generally in the 19th and early 20th century were not something that you did in any legal way. You just kind of decided one day you were going to be one name and the next day you were another name. And that's basically how it was done. So if we think about how name changes are done now, it's definitely done in a legal system. You have to go to court and have your name changed. That was not the case 100 years ago. You could just change your name to whatever you wanted to change it to. And there were also people that switched back and forth. Sometimes they used one name and other times they used another name. Maybe they would have used their more ethnic name within their ethnic group. Other times they would have used an easier name that other people could pronounce. So there were lots of reasons for name changes, but they were not changed on Ellis Island or in any other immigration port. Here's an example of a passenger ticket from 1859. This one happens to be a fairly easy name, Nicholas Fish, but you can see there's if it's printed by a human hand, there's lots of room for interpretation as far as writing goes here. So that also could be part of the problem. So a lot of the times we see TV shows or we see pictures or we see different things that lead us to believe that the immigration experience was something that was very difficult. Well, it is true that 150 years ago, or in the early part of the 19th century, that taking on an immigration experience was very difficult because it took a long time. It took a long time to get here. But as the 19th century came around, things started to get easier. Immigration became more common. So if you were living somewhere, say in Ireland, maybe in about 1860 or 1870, chances are you probably knew somebody that had immigrated. So you probably had some idea of what the process was going to be like. So most people would have been familiar with things that happened during the immigration process. And there were lots of changes occurring to the actual process too. In the 1860s, it took at least a month to arrive in the United States from Europe. And that was because that ships were generally sailing ships. They didn't have a lot of choice as to how fast they went once they got on the open ocean. But once steamships became normal for immigrant ships, the time to get here from Europe was reduced quite a bit. So from 30 to 40 days in the 1860s to 6 to 12 days in the 1890s. So a huge difference there. A steerage ticket cost about $25 in the 1890s, which, you know, for us doesn't seem like a huge amount of money, but it was a fairly significant amount of money in those days. And as the 20th century came into being, the prices tended to get a little bit less. most people who were coming here by the 1890s had some idea of what to expect. They knew that they would go to a particular place to be examined. They knew that if they didn't have enough money or if they didn't have a place to go, that they may be held and they might have to have some kind of clearance to be able to be let go into New York or wherever it is they were coming to. So they did have some idea of the process, so they would have been prepared for that. The average passenger at Ellis Island would have cleared the health and legal inspections in about 3 hours. So that's not too difficult. That was something that they would have known about and that they would have prepared for. Obviously, this isn't true in all cases, but it definitely would have been true in most cases. So one of the things that would determine greatly what your experience was what class you were traveling in. So if you were lucky enough to be a first or second class passenger, and most of our immigrant ancestors probably weren't, you really would have had a very minimal inspection. Someone just would have maybe asked you a couple of questions, but that would have been about it. The conventional thinking in those days was that if you could afford a first or second class ticket, then you probably were not going to become a burden on society. So they would allow you to just go right through. Unfortunately, if you were a steerage passenger, which many of our immigrant ancestors were, your processing would have taken a little longer. You would have had to be screened for diseases. You would have had to be screened for your employment prospects. You would have been asked if you were meeting someone in this country. So all of those things would have been factors in determining how long it would take you to get from the port you got to your destination. But that being said, only about 2% of immigrants were excluded from entry to the United States. So that's not really a huge number. So generally, if your ancestor came here in steerage, they probably got off the boat eventually and were allowed to continue on their way and to go where they needed to go. So another myth that people think is that once their ancestor arrived here, they never went back to their country. And while that can be certainly true of some ethnic groups, there are others that it would be the exception. The ethnic groups that would be least likely to return to their homelands were Irish, Germans, or Jews. And Jews, we can probably figure that there was a very good reason for them leaving the place that they left. And they didn't want to return to it. Same could be said for Irish or even Germans. But in general, the Irish and the Germans were some of the earliest immigrant groups coming here. In those days, the passages back and forth were very long and difficult. They didn't really want to take another month to go back to Ireland or Germany, so they would have stayed here. And the longer they stayed here, the more assimilated they became, and they would have just found that the United States was their home. When we get to later immigrants, such as Italians, for example, they would come here for work seasonally. So a lot of times they would come over here to work, and then when they were done with the seasonal work, they would return to Italy with the money that they earned. Sometimes they would come and they would save their money and they would send for their family members later on. You also see this with Irish into the late 19th century, early 20th century. You will see people returning to Ireland for things like family members' funerals. I've also seen examples where families will go to Ireland and that's where their oldest child will be born for whatever reason. They just wanted to return to Ireland for that purpose. So you do find in the later 19th century and early 20th century, people going back and forth a little bit more. The passage was more affordable and it was also much less time. So it would have been easier for them to go back and forth. So I guess one of the statistics that I found in doing this presentation is that as many as 30% of immigrants to the United States would have returned to their homelands. Some of them did return after coming here with the intention of staying. Some of them came here and decided that maybe the United States wasn't all it was cracked up to be, and they decided they wanted to go back to where they came from. So that was something that did happen occasionally. but not as often. So you will say about 30% of the immigrants would have returned to their homeland for whatever reason, either permanently or for a visit. Another thing that you hear sometimes is that people think that you needed to be a U.S. citizen in order to own property or to have your own business. Now, this is not true. Although there were different rules going from state to state, in general, you were not required to be a full citizen to either purchase property or to own a business. You could file what is known as a declaration of intention, which meant that you intended to become a citizen at some point. Some people would have filed a declaration of intention and then never gotten around to completing the process of naturalization. Maybe they would have filed the declaration somewhere and then moved somewhere else and forgotten that they did it. Or maybe they just never intended to become a citizen and just filed the declaration to have the bare minimum of paperwork on file. In the early years of naturalization, you did have a certain amount of time before you had to file your final papers for citizenship. Early in the 20th century, these laws were repealed. So there was not as a time limit as there was in the earlier years. You will sometimes find in the 20th century that people file their declaration of intention when they get off the boat and then 30, 40 years later finally get around to filing their final paperwork. So don't be surprised if you find these papers and find a big gap between the two. It's definitely not uncommon. You also may find the two have been filed in completely different places. That was something that was certainly possible to do. You may find one document and not another, simply because they are filed in different places, and there's no central repository for these documents. You kind of have to know where your immigrant ancestor lived in order to look for them. So it can be quite a process. One of the things that the United States government did was they advertised for people to come and settle in the western part of this country, in the Midwestern part of this country. There was vast amounts of land that was unsettled. And the United States, of course, acquired a lot of this land with the Louisiana Purchase and with other land transactions, and they were looking for people to settle. So they would place ads in European newspapers, they would put ads up in European towns looking for people to come and settle the land. So this was something that was specifically done to encourage immigration. So therefore, it was not a requirement that a person be a citizen in order to have this land and to settle on it. So it was deliberately done by the government to attract settlers. Also then, another thing that sometimes people who were in other countries and were looking for a way to make a better life for themselves possibly would have come to the United States to serve in the military. One of the conflicts that was going on when there were a lot of immigrants coming to this country was the Civil War. Again, it would have been something that people would have recruited people to come and join the military to fight in the Civil War. Both the Union and the Confederate armies did this. And they would have promised U.S. citizenship by your service. You did not automatically become a citizen by serving with the U.S. military. You would have had to file a little bit of paperwork in order to do this. In 1862, with a law that was passed, you did not have to file a declaration of intention. So if you were serving in the war and after the war you got out and you were honorably discharged, you could go to court and you could get your citizenship simply by presenting your service, proof of your service, and proof of an honorable discharge. Generally, those came in the form of affidavits, something like this. This is an affidavit from a captain of a company in the 1st Rhode Island Cavalry. And he was writing to let the court know that Andrew Dougherty, who was a soldier that served under him, was honorably discharged, and he served in the Civil War. So Andrew was able to bring this letter to court and gain his United States citizenship simply by virtue of having this piece of paper. And the other significant part about this piece of paper is that it tells us where Andrew Doherty was born. He was born in Galway in Ireland. So it's a very useful piece of paper to have because it tells you a good bit of information about your ancestor. So another thing that people don't really think about or don't really realize is, what about women? What about women? How did citizenship affect them? Sometimes people will say, well, I know that my immigrant ancestor, my great-great-grandmother, became a citizen. I want to find where I can find her citizenship papers. Well, the truth is that women didn't really require citizenship until they were given the right to vote in 1919. So prior to this, there really would not have been any reason for a woman to look for citizenship on her own. Women were given derivative citizenship. It's called derivative citizenship under their husbands. So when their husbands were granted citizenship, that citizenship right would have extended to their wives, and it also would have extended to any of their minor children. So if they had minor children that were born in the country that they came from, then those minor children would become citizens under their fathers. If the child was over 18 years of age when they immigrated, they would have had to do their own immigration, or they would have had to do their own naturalization. So children were granted citizenship if they were born in another country and they were under the age of 18 when their father became a citizen. After women were given the right to vote in 1919, then they did have to do their own naturalizations. So if a woman arrived here after 1919, then she would have filed for her own naturalization. And you will find those right alongside the males with the naturalization records. And the 14th Amendment was the amendment that allowed for derivative citizenship for families, for children, and for people that were born here. So say your immigrant ancestor arrived here and then had children here. Even if he was not a citizen, his children would be given citizenship because they were born in the United States. And that's the way that this law still stands today. So that was where that came from in 1868. Another thing I hear a lot, my ancestor arrived here on the Mayflower. Well, that could very well be. And one of the things that is probably one of the more well-known immigrant ships arrived here before the United States was even a country. The facts and figures about the Mayflower left England in 1620. There was only 120 passengers on the ship, and many of them didn't survive the trip or the first winter once they got here. There were 26 heads of families who arrived on the Mayflower, and of those 26, those are the 26 that are known to have left descendants. The original Mayflower made only one voyage. So you would have to be descended from one of these 26 heads of families in order to have had your ancestor come on the Mayflower. The estimation is that there's about 35 million people worldwide who are descendants of Mayflower passengers, which is a fairly decent number if you think about how long ago this was. It wasn't that long ago. So 35 million people is a fairly impressive number. If you are interested in pursuing to see if you have Mayflower heritage, I would highly recommend going to the Mayflower Society website. They have lots of information about the descendants of these 26 heads of families, and they can probably help you with figuring that out if you do have an ancestor who came on the Mayflower. So those are some of the myths. So now, how do we find out about our immigrant ancestor? What are some of the things that we can do to find out if the stories we've heard are true? Well, you always need to start at the beginning. And we go back to census records so often because they contain so much good information. Census records can help us pinpoint when our ancestor arrived here. The later census records are going to be best for this. And if you have an ancestor that arrived a little earlier, there are a few tricks. But basically, your later census records are going to be good for this. Censuses from 1900 through 1930 give exact years of immigration. So if you can find your ancestor in the 1900 census, the question was asked, what year did you arrive here? And they will have an answer to that question. So that will give you some information about when they possibly got here. One of the things that I should point out about the years given in census records is they're probably not going to be consistent. The best that you can get is an idea, because you may find that they answer a year in the 1900 census, they may answer a different year in 1910 or a different year in 1920. It depends on how much they were remembering, how accurate their memory was, who was giving the information. So there's lots of factors at work here. But the point is that census records can give you good clues to start with. For earlier immigrants, you can obviously tell if they were here by if they are recorded in the census. You can also tell by where their children were born. If their children were born in a different country, then you can narrow down when exactly they may have arrived here. Maybe the older children were born in a different country and the younger children were born in this country. So that gives you a range of years to look in. If you're in New York State, the 1855 census asks the question, how long have you lived in this community? While that's not an actual date of immigration, it can give you some idea of how long your ancestor has lived in that particular area. So that may narrow it down. That may narrow it down the years to search. So don't discard the census records. They can be very useful. Naturalization records can be also incredibly useful, especially later naturalization records. These are great for giving you exact information, or as close to exact as you're likely to get. This one from 1918 is a declaration of intention, and it gives us a lot of great information about where and when Luther Reed arrived in this country. It tells us the name of a ship. It tells us the date that he arrived here. And again, these are probably not going to be exact, but they're going to give you a good place to start looking. So it helps. Generally, I find that, as with all of us, our recall of dates may not be wonderful, but we could probably remember the name of the ship that we came on, or we could probably remember the port that we came into. So when you're doing this and when you're looking at these records, keep in mind how you would think and what your memory recall would be like, because it's very, very possible that your ancestors' memory recall may have been similar to how you would think. So think in terms of that. Dates, specific dates, are not going to be as well remembered as places and possibly ship names. So keep that in mind. Passenger lists can be searched at a variety of different places. Ancestry, Family Search, Ellis Island has its own website for searching passenger records. Castle Garden also has a website. There's a couple of lesser known websites for searching, especially older passenger lists. Immigrant Ships Transcribers Guild and the Olive Tree Genealogy page. These are fairly older websites that have some transcriptions of early passenger lists. There are also some the addresses for these websites are on the handout, so you can check them out. Passenger lists can be very difficult to search for a variety of reasons. Most of them, I would think, have to do with availability. Not all passenger records were ever found and indexed. Some of them, there's a great deal of them that are missing. Their indexing has been kind of spotty, not that great. The writing and the condition of them are both factors. People that were indexing them had to deal with horrible handwriting and lots of different things. So there's a lot of issues around transcription of these records. One of the ways that you can get around that is by using Steve Morse's website. If you're not familiar with Steve Morse, he is a person who is very into computers. He make search engines for websites that don't have great search engines. One of the prime examples is the Ellis Island website. If you have ever tried to search for your immigrant ancestor on the Ellis Island website, you know that it can be very difficult to find information. It doesn't give you a lot of search opportunities. It doesn't give you a lot of latitude for spelling, which we know is something that's a problem. If you use the search engines on Steve Morse's website, you are going to get a lot more flexibility with searches. You can search with a little information, you can search with a lot of information. There's a lot of flexibility for searching. So I would recommend, if you're searching the Ellis Island website, to use the search engines at Steve Morse's website. They're definitely well worth it. So why am I having trouble finding my ancestor on a passenger list? Just from personal experience, I can tell you that in 25 years of looking at passenger lists, I will find less than 50% of the people that I'm searching for. And that's got to do with a lot of reasons. There's a lot of reasons for that. Probably number one, spelling. Spelling is going to be an issue. Depends on how you spell the name. Your interpretation of the spelling can differ from your ancestor's interpretation. It can differ from the person that has indexed the record's interpretation. It can differ from how whatever search engine is that you're using. So there's lots of reasons for spelling problems. When people were indexing these records, they had to contend with difficult handwriting, which would lead to poor indexing. Incomplete records, also another huge factor. Probably or possibly one of the reasons you can't find your immigrant ancestors passenger list is because maybe that page or that whole manifest is no longer in existence. You may have the wrong port. You may have the wrong date. You may not have all the information that you need. You may not be very experienced with database searching. There are lots of factors. I find that they are very difficult to search. One of the major problems, another one that's not listed here, but a major problem is when you're dealing with someone that has a very common name. If you're looking for your ancestor Michael Murphy, who maybe came over here in the 1860s, it may be very hard to tell which Michael Murphy, because in any given year, there could be as many as 50 or 60 people named Michael Murphy that come over here. And with the very limited information that's given on a passenger list, it can be next to impossible to figure out which one is your ancestor. I find the ones that I have the most success with are people that come over in family groups. So a mother and a father and their children together are a lot easier to spot on a passenger list than just a single person. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. I can recommend, if you want to know about anything immigration-wise, I can recommend this book. It's called They Came in Ships. It's by John Philip Coletta. It's very well researched. It can answer any question about immigration that you may have. So not only about the immigration process, but also about the records that we use for immigration. It's wonderful because it has lots of information about references, places to find records, what the records contain, dates that certain ports were in operation. So basically anything immigration can be found in this book. I know that some of the library systems in the area have this book, and when the libraries reopen, you can certainly borrow it. So it's definitely something to look for. Passenger lists are, I find that a lot of people are very interested in passenger lists. They're interested in finding their ancestor on a passenger list. Sometimes you have to ask yourself if it's worth it or not. You maybe spend a lot of time looking for something that it really isn't going to give you a lot of information. Generally, in the 19th century, passenger lists were lists of names. They had approximate ages on them. They generally would have very vague types of occupations. A lot of times you'll just see things like servant or laborer or child. So you're not going to see a lot of really specific occupations. You also won't see specific destinations. You won't see specific places of origin. So generally they're pretty sparse. and there's not a lot of information to be gotten from them. Once we get into the 20th century, though, then we start to find passenger lists that have quite a bit of information on them. They can have information about where the person lived before they got on the boat. They will have names and addresses of their next of kin in the country that they left. They will have a name and address of the person that they are going to join in the new world. So that's also great information. They even have columns for how much money do you have with you? Have you been in the United States before? So there can be lots of really good information on more modern passenger lists. And that's because in 1906, the United States decided that they were going to begin keeping track of immigrants. And so they took over the management of the immigration records. Prior to this, it was sort of haphazard. Sometimes the states would have something to do with it. The United States Customs Service took over from 1820 to 1891. They did not really have a very good system down. In 1906, that was all reformed, and the United States Immigration Service was formed, and it took over the gathering of information for immigrants. So it took over the passenger lists and also the naturalization record process. So prior to 1906, naturalizations could be performed in just about any court that would do them. So you see them in county court, you see them in town court, you see them in police court, you see them in all kinds of different courts. After 1906, naturalizations had to be performed in federal courts. So that became a law in 1906. So it makes it a little easier to find them after 1906. There are also a few other sources for information about immigrants. These tend to be a little bit more modern sources. So things like an alien registration form, which was required during World War II if you were an alien. Canadian border crossings, which did not begin until 1895. Or passport applications. The passport applications can be very interesting because some of them include pictures, but they tended to only include those that were going to somewhere from the United States, people that were already citizens, and they only go up to 1925. So their appeal can be fairly limited, but if you can find somebody in them, you will find some really good information. Okay, questions. What do we got for questions?
Okay, we have somebody who is joining us from Ireland today, which is wonderful. Thank you for being here. Says, just a little warning, be careful. I have a great uncle that did not have a great start in life here in Ireland. And on the US Census, he stated that he was born in Massachusetts when he was actually born in Ireland.
Yes, absolutely. Those kinds of mistakes are made all the time. Whether it's a recording mistake on the part of the person who took the census or whether it was a deliberate kind of, you know, I want to be born in Massachusetts, so therefore I'm going to give that information. Your best bet for ferreting out information like that is to collect a lot of information about the person. So if the chances are fairly good that if it wasn't true, then they won't be consistent in their reporting, and you may get different information in a different record. So yes, absolutely, those things happen, and you have to gather the evidence and then look at it all together and then figure out what the actual answer is. There are usually not too many definites in the world of genealogy. There's a lot of things that we have to kind of sort of look at and make our own judgments about. So yes, that's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, we also have a question about declaration of intention. Do you have to apply for a declaration of intention? Would you be able to apply for a Social Security card if you were still considered an alien?
That is really a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I would guess that you would have to be a citizen in order to apply for a Social Security card, but I don't know that 100%. That's something I could find out about and get back to you. It's possible it could have been done with a declaration of intention. I just don't know, but I could get back to you about that.
Okay, great. Another question, can you give some bibliography on articles or books about derivative citizenship for spouses prior to 1919?
Okay, another thing I would have to do some research on and get back to you. I'm looking at the handout that you got, there are some sources on the handout that you got. Some websites that may have some. I would say that archives.gov, the National Archives website, may have some information about that particular issue. The other place that you could try would be Cindy's list of genealogy sites on the internet. There's bound to be some reading about the citizenship process on Cindy's list. Her site is divided into categories. So I would search under the citizenship or naturalization category to see if you can find something under there. But that would be a good source to look at things for that, an answer to that question.
Okay, we have a couple more here. When you have different information recorded on the passenger ship and on the Declaration of Intention, such as a different arriving ship, which one do you think is more accurate?
So the two things that are differing are the declaration and the ship. So I would definitely believe the ship, because you are looking at a list that comes directly from that ship. So obviously the person who's filling out the list would have the correct name of the ship on it, you would hope. And it's possible that depending on when the Declaration of Intention was filled out, it's possible that the person who was filling it out just didn't remember. But another possibility is also maybe they made more than one trip to the United States. So possibly they're referring to another trip in the Declaration of Intention, and they're thinking about another ship name. So that's another thing to think about.
So many complicating factors.
Oh, yes.
One more here. Did children travel alone to the United States? My grandfather's brother came in 1872 when he was 11, and I can't find who he came with.
I would say yes. Yes, they could have definitely come alone or with someone who wasn't necessarily their relative. There are documentations of many schemes where orphans would have come to the United States to either be adopted by other people or to work or in different situations, or possibly someone who was traveling without their parents was traveling to this country to live with relatives. So that's definitely a possibility. I would say it is possible. It can be very difficult, though, to find them on ship lists unless you can identify a person that they're traveling with. The best you could do would be to use their name and then maybe narrow it down using the time period that they came here and their age. Again, keep in mind the ages are going to be very approximate. Even for children, they can be off by a few years. So definitely keep that in mind, and maybe come up with a list of possibilities from the passenger list that may possibly be the person that you're looking for. Again, it's about gathering all of the evidence from lots of different sources and then laying it out and seeing what makes sense.
Another question about passenger lists. How were passenger lists arranged? As ticket purchased? Would the people listed before or after probably come with your ancestor?
I believe that generally they are listed in order of embarkation. So they would have done the first class passengers first, and you will usually find them on the first page of a passenger manifest. Then they would have done second class, and then finally they would have done steerage. Generally, you will find family groups traveling together. However, that may not always be the case. You may have to sometimes search, if you find one suspected family member, search the same ship for other family members who may be further down the page or on a page before or a page after. I have found generally that most family groups are listed together on passenger lists, but occasionally you will find them broken apart. Not so much with littler children, but with older children, you may find them listed separately on the same ship list.
Another note from our participant in Ireland, sometimes people traveled with neighbors. People from Ireland sometimes use the Townland name, she said.
Yes, they did do that. And definitely people from Ireland would have traveled with friends, neighbors. Sometimes whole townlands would have come over together and settled together in the same area of the United States. Very common, especially with Irish people. I often advise people that if you're researching your Irish ancestor, make sure that you look at their neighbors when you're looking at the census record. You will see people from the same area in Ireland that they were from. You'll also find relatives among baptism sponsors and marriage witnesses. So you always want to look at that group of people around your ancestor. Elizabeth Schoen Mills, who's a well-known genealogist, calls it the fan club. Friends, associates, and neighbors. Those are the people that you want to examine because they give you information about your ancestor that you may not be able to find directly about your ancestor. So it's always a good idea to keep that network of people in mind.
That's great, Lisa. Thank you. I don't have any more questions right now, but we'll give it just another minute in case any last questions occur to anyone. Just want to let everybody know that our next program with Lisa will be on July 13th, which is a Monday at the same time, 12 to 1, and that will be on understanding ancestry DNA test results. Lisa is also available on her Facebook page for questions, and hopefully it's eventually back in the building, but we're not sure when that will happen just yet.
Right.
Anything
so
else?
That's every Wednesday. Every Wednesday on my Facebook page, which is Upstate NY Genealogy. I take questions from whenever you ask them on Wednesday till whenever you're done asking them on Wednesday. So all day Wednesday, I take questions. I'm usually pretty quick to respond. Just depends on where I'm going. Like, for example, this Wednesday I have to take my mom to the doctor, so you know there may be a little lull there, but I do answer any questions I get. If I can't answer the question, I try to at least point you to a source that may be able to answer the question for you. So hopefully we'll be able to get something on that. And that's going to continue through the summer. I don't have any plans to go anywhere live at the moment, but hopefully eventually we'll get back to live, but that will continue through the summer. So hopefully if you have questions, you can ask them on Wednesdays.
And Lisa, I think you had a different handout that you wanted to distribute for this presentation as well.
Yes.
So
the handout, the other handout that I have basically just goes along with the presentation. So it's the content of the slides basically. So. Okay.
So we'll get that out to everybody who participated today in pretty short order. Let me just make sure we don't have. All right. It doesn't look like anybody has any other questions. So just say thank you to everybody for participating today. It was great to have you with us, and we hope to see you next time. Keep an eye on our library calendar and our social media, Facebook and Instagram, to find out more about what's going on at the library. And feel free to get in touch if you have any questions or comments or anything else you'd like to discuss.
Thanks very much for coming, everybody. We'll see you next month.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you all. Have a good afternoon.
You too.
Bye-bye.